Okay, I guess we are ready to start. If more people will join us later, then they will only miss the introduction so far. Thanks very much for joining us today, and welcome to the first of our 4 webinars on Fortum Uniper, which is co-organized by Ken Europe and Urgewald. My name is Sebastian Rötters from Urgewald, and I'm very glad that my colleague JC Bingler joined me today to co-moderate this event, because as I'm not the technical expert, I'm really glad that I don't have to handle this alone. So JC will also give you a short introduction about the technical details of this webinar, and then I come back with some information on the content.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. We already mentioned it a few minutes ago. If you just joined and you still haven't muted yourself, please go ahead and mute yourself so there's no interference or weird echo. Apart from that, again, welcome and thanks for joining. There are just 2 or 3 things I briefly wanted to mention. First of all, we are recording this webinar, which means that we can make it available to you after the session. We're probably going to upload it to our website. And we are also going to cut out the Q&A part at the end, meaning if you want to ask questions at the end, and I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute, feel free to answer whatever questions, and don't worry about those being recorded, because we're going to end the recording or edit it out at the end, because we wanted to make sure that everyone felt like they could open a discussion and didn't have to worry about the whole Q&A being recorded. That being said, we decided to cover the presentations first and save the questions for the very end, unless you have a very, very, very urgent question because you really don't understand what is going on, what is being discussed. Feel free to type your question in the little chat, and whoever is presenting, if they have time, if they see it, can maybe quickly answer your question just to make sure that you understand what we're talking about. But apart from that, if it's anything else, please save it for the end, for the Q&A part. And since so many people are participating, we decided to use the chat and not the, the video and speaking in person option to answer questions. So if you have a question, type it into the chat. If your question doesn't get answered, feel free to send Sebastian an email, because then he can either answer your question himself or forward it to the other hosts in case they would be more apt in answering your question. I think, let me check, but I think that should have been it. Like I said, the meeting is going to be recorded. So if you would like to rewatch certain parts, or maybe even share it with somebody else afterwards, feel free to do so. And the Q&A is going to be excluded from that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, JC. We were very surprised about the big interest in this webinar today, but it indicates us that the topic is of very high interest, and our aim is to give a very good introduction into the topic. And this is why we're very happy to have Pia Eberhardt and Bart-Jaap Verbeek today with us, who will guide us through the jungle of the Energy Charter Treaty and explain how and why this treaty became such a powerful and dangerous tool for Fortum and Uniper to fight progressive climate legislation. We are certainly aware that we cannot cover all the aspects of the Energy Charter Treaty and the claim threats against the Netherlands in the upcoming 60 to 90 minutes. Nevertheless, we hope that you all get out of this webinar with an idea of the Charter Treaty and the dangers arising from it, especially with regard to the current situation in the Netherlands. The webinar is designed to share special knowledge about the topics, but we are aware that also many activists have registered and still join us, but I fear that at the end we won't have time to have a concrete discussion about concrete action. Nevertheless, we are, of course, as NGOs and civil society organizations, interested that many of you join us in the fight against this treaty and against the claim in the Netherlands. So feel free to drop an email to me, sebastian@urgewald.org, or to jc@urgewald.org afterwards, and then we can keep Pia and Bart-Jaap also in the loop if they're open question, or if you have concrete ideas for actions. Before we start with the first presentation, I would also remind you that this is just the first of 4 webinars that we've designed so far. We will continue next week, next Wednesday, with a webinar on Datteln 4, the very controversial coal plant in Germany and the German coal phase out. This webinar will take place on the 5th of February. Then we continue after a little break because we ourselves will be in Helsinki to have direct talks with people in Finland. So we continue 1 week later with a webinar on Uniper's gas infrastructure strategy and with special attention on the planned LNG terminal in Wilhelmshaven. This will take place on the 19th of February. We will end this first round of webinars on the 4th of March with a webinar on Fortum's and Uniper's dirty coal imports from Russia, and in the case of Uniper, also from Colombia. And yeah, we really hope that if you liked today's webinar, that you will also sign in for the other 3. This having said, I guess it doesn't have to be the last webinar on this topic. So if there's a big group of people who says, oh wow, what Pia and Bart-Jaap have told us is very interesting, but we would like to have an in-depth webinar, then also write us an email and we can check if we can organize like second round. Let's dive into the concrete matters. I would like to hand over to Pia Eberhardt now. Pia, she's a trade and investment expert at the Brussels-based NGO Corporate Europe Observatory, and she will start with her presentation on the Energy Charter Treaty, which then will be followed by Bart-Jaap's presentation about the implications that this treaty and the concrete case of Uniper against the Netherlands, a possible case of Uniper against the Netherlands, might have. Thanks for the moment, and let's hope that technically we get this done.
Sorry. I hope we're getting there. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you also to Urgewald and to Ken for organizing this webinar, and for all of you to all of you for dialing in. It's really exciting to see the big interest in this issue. So what I would like to talk you through, as Sebastian already said, is the Energy Charter Treaty, or ECT. So what is it? I will talk a little bit about some emblematic cases that have happened under this treaty. Then move on to the ECT as an obstacle to climate action, and then give you a little bit of an outlook on where we are with this agreement, what will happen this year, and hopefully also probably beyond. So what is the Energy Charter Treaty? It is an international agreement that was signed in the mid-1990s. The historical context was a bit the end of the Soviet Union and the wish of Western countries, but also fossil fuel companies in countries like the Netherlands or France or the UK to get access to energy resources in the East. Today it applies in 51 states, mostly in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, but also Central Asia and Japan. Importantly, the EU as a whole is a member on its own, so not just its member states. The Energy Charter Treaty is quite a long agreement. It contains many rules, for example, on energy transit, on energy efficiency. But here I will only speak about one part of the agreement, that is the rights it gives to foreign investors in the energy sector, because they are really the most enforceable rules and also the one with the biggest impacts. What they mean, in short, is they give sweeping powers to energy investors to sue states over anything that states do that investors argue has damaged their investments. This is a bit boring for many of the trade campaigners in this webinar, and there are quite a few, as I've seen. but maybe not already well known for everyone else. So this regime is called Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It is included in the Energy Charter Treaty. And just to show you again how it works, so you have an investor, for example, a Swedish energy company Vattenfall, that invests in another country, for example, Germany, and then sues that country over, and it can be potentially everything. It can be a law enacted by parliament, it can be a decision by a court, and it can be a decision by the executive of that country, for example, when it comes to renewing or not renewing licenses. And these decisions can happen on the local, the regional, or the federal level. All of them can be challenged under the ECT. And if an investor wins, so if the tribunal deciding the case finds, well, your rights have been violated, then the state is ordered normally to pay compensation, and that can be quite a lot of money, as we will hear. Two things are particularly relevant. One is that these lawsuits are not decided in a country's court, so by the European Court of Justice, but by three private people, three private lawyers, the so-called arbitrators. And the other special feature is that the legal base, so the material, the substantive law, is not a country's constitution or what's written in European law. It's what is written in the Energy Charter Treaty, so the rights given to investors in this agreement, which are very one-sided, because it's basically only rights and no obligations. We know a couple of cases. I would like to talk you through a couple of cases that have happened under the Energy Charter Treaty or are ongoing. One is the first claim that Vattenfall filed against Germany already quite a few years ago. The issue was a coal-fired power plant in the north of Germany, where the government, after a lot of protests from locals, did not shut it down, unfortunately, but decided to tighten the environmental regulations for this plant. So the question was, how much water can be taken from the local river to cool the plant? Obviously, this has a big impact on flora and fauna. The government tightened the rules, and Vattenfall sued Germany for 1.4 billion euros in compensation. That was obviously so much money, and the local government in Hamburg was so afraid of being responsible for this payout of German taxpayer money that they basically obeyed. This claim led to a settlement in German courts where one element was the relaxation of the environmental standards. So it's an example of a case where that was settled, where the investor got what it wanted, which is not the money, but laxer rules. As this was so successful, Vattenfall said, oh, let's just do it again. We have an ongoing claim by Vattenfall also for many years against Germany. This time it's a bit more expensive. It sits at 6.1 billion euros now that Vattenfall wants from German taxpayers. This time it's about the decision to accelerate, to speed up the nuclear exit after the Fukushima disaster. And we expect a ruling in this case probably this year. Another case is also ongoing against Italy. It is a case over a ban on new oil and gas drilling near the Italian coast. That ban came after a decade of citizen protests over mainly environmental concerns, but also local tourism and fisheries industries. The company that is responsible for one of the platforms that they plan to open a new rock hopper in the UK is suing Italy. We don't know much. The CEO at one point said this claim could be for up to 350 million in compensation. And last but not least, a claim that was launched last year against Sweden. It's the first time Sweden is being sued. It's sued by an Australian company that is unhappy with a ban on uranium mining that the Swedish parliament enacted. It's also quite an expensive claim for 1.8 billion euros in compensation. So this already might give you an idea of the amount of the kind of decisions that are vulnerable and are already being attacked under the ECT. The treaty is more than 20 years old, but in the first 10 years, not so many claims were filed. In the first decade, we know of only 19 cases. This changes dramatically in the last 10 years, where we see a jump of cases that you also see illustrated here. By the end of last year, we knew of 128 claims. That might not seem a lot to you, but in international law, it is quite a lot. No other agreement in the world has led to more such investor attacks against states than the Energy Charter Treaty. And I always say these are the known claims, because it is possible under the agreement to keep the existence of a claim secret, to keep it completely hidden from the public. So it is likely that there are quite a few more cases which we don't even know of. The cases we know of often have very little information that you can find in public. In recent years, more and more experts have warned that this agreement will be a very big problem in times of climate change. Here I cite two of them who warn that any action on climate change is likely to lead to claims by affected investors under the ECT. The reason being that the ECT protects fossil fuel investments. Not only, it also protects renewable investments, but it does protect oil, coal, gas. So all the investors that have oil, gas, coal in their portfolios, these assets are protected under the ECT. That is a problem for closing down existing facilities like we have to do, but it is also an incentive, one could argue, for continuing to invest in oil, gas and coal, which obviously we must stop. Why is the ECT such a big problem? Because you can also imagine court cases by the oil industry in national courts, and we have also already seen some. What makes this regime particularly attractive for investors is the money it can bring, because compensation orders are retrospective and they are uncapped. So investors regularly walk away not just with money that they have actually spent on a project and might have lost, but they can get compensation for lost expected future profits. And as you can imagine, for example, for an oil pipeline, this can be quite a lot of money. And these awards can be enforced against countries around the world. So if you lose and you don't pay, your money that you have in a foreign bank can be confiscated. So it's a really powerful regime, and that makes it so scary for countries and so likely that they take any threat and any actual case seriously, and that it might really keep them away from doing what they urgently have to do to protect the planet. This is just an illustration of the money we know of that is already at stake. So on the left side, you see the $52 billion that countries have already been ordered to pay in cases that have already been decided, and it's actually not so many cases because many are still ongoing. The amount of money we know of for ongoing cases sits at $32 billion. But as I said, it's just a tiny share of the money that will really be at stake, because for many of the claims we don't know what the investor wants, and there are claims we don't even know of. What you see here is a quote by a former government official from the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is one of the countries that has been sued most often under the Energy Charter Treaty. She used to work for the Ministry of Finance and was responsible for defending claims. And here she says that not just under the Energy Charter Treaty, but under treaties with similar provisions as well, she or her government gets a threat to be sued every month. So that is quite a lot. And she also says that obviously we take it seriously, we review the risks, how strong the claim is, and we try to minimize the costs of the state. So this goes back to this incentive of states to actually prevent a claim by maybe letting the coal-fired power plant just run an extra 5 years or an extra 10 years to minimize the legal risk. This is why in December last year, we got together quite a large coalition of civil society groups and trade unions who say, this is enough, this has to stop. We believe that the Energy Charter Treaty is incompatible with the Paris Climate Agreement, just transition policies and other necessary public policy measures. So there is quite a bit of a fuss around this agreement at the moment. Where are we now, or what can be expected in the this year and the years to come? I just wanted to very briefly mention 4 developments, just so that you are aware that they are happening. There is an ongoing process which has just started to modernize the Energy Charter Treaty. This is a process that is driven by the EU and other already existing members of the agreements who have realized, this agreement from the mid-90s is a bit out of date with what we would negotiate now. We need to change it. There are 4 negotiation rounds planned for this year. Importantly, the agenda, so the issues that the treaty partners want to look into and where they want to discuss changes it's long, but it's very narrow. What you could imagine would make sense from a climate change perspective, for example, would to say, okay, this treaty can no longer protect fossil fuels. Fossil fuel protection must be phased out or ended. Something like this is not on the agenda. Or ISDS, so the right of investors to sue governments directly outside of their courts, also is not on the agenda. So this process is very much about tinkering around the edges. And I would argue that even the tinkering around the edges is not very likely to lead to much, because all of the treaty partners, so more than 50 countries, will need to agree for a treaty change to happen. And when you look at some of the countries, and like Japan, for example, has already come out and said, oh, we don't see any problems with this agreement. So it's very unlikely that this process will lead to something that will really make the agreement less dangerous for climate action. This is why we hope that there will be more momentum this year and in the next years for countries to leave the Energy Charter Treaty or to jointly terminate them. It's possible for nearly all treaty partners to leave the Energy Charter Treaty right away. Legally, it's not so difficult. You send a letter, you say, we're out, and your exit takes effect a year later. Italy already did that. It said so at the end of 2014, and its exit took effect in January 2016. So it is possible. What you have to know of is that there's a catch in the agreement. We call it the zombie clause. Officially, it's called the sunset or survival clause. And it basically says when a country leaves, it can still be sued under the Energy Charter Treaty for 20 more years for all the investments that had taken place before the exit. So obviously that is a huge problem, this clause, but at least investments that happen after can no longer lead to a challenge. Because of this clause, but also because of a controversy around the agreement, more and more people are starting to think of a multilateral exit. For example, you could imagine a scenario where the EU member states, and probably a number of like-minded states as well, leave the agreement together and say that they agree that the zombie clause does not take effect amongst them. And a termination of the treaty by all the treaty partners, I think, is unlikely, but who knows? A third process that is happening is that there is a lot of controversy about this treaty being applied within the EU. So many of the claims, actually 66 of the claims we know of, are from an EU-based investor, say Vattenfall in Sweden, against another EU member state like Germany. This shouldn't happen. We have EU courts to deal with issues in the internal market. So there is a huge controversy about how to stop this, whether to stop this amongst EU member states, and the issue will potentially also end up in European courts. And last but not least, there is a very worrying process that has been pushed by the Secretariat of the Energy Charter Treaty, which is based in Brussels, to expand the agreement to new signatories in the Global South. So countries that are not yet members, but the Secretariat wants them to become members. We don't know exactly where the process is at this moment because there is because of public pressure, a bit of crisis in this process, but it might pick up again. Instead of a conclusion, I wanted to quote a person who is, I think, also a participant in the webinar. I hope you don't mind, Hermina. She used to work at the Secretariat in Brussels, so she knows what she's talking about and has written great stuff and put forward arguments for the EU and its member states to really, really withdraw from the agreement because it protects fossil fuel investments and their related carbon emissions. And that is a huge problem for every country that is serious about tackling climate change. And with that, and the last reading recommendation, namely a website and a nearly 100 pages strong report, which you find on that website, I would like to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Pia, for your presentation. And I guess, yeah, many people are asking now, damn, this is a really big problem. Let's get to a very concrete case to understand a bit more what the consequences can be in the discussion with Fortum and Uniper. So I would immediately hand over to Bart Jaap. He's a researcher at SOMO, the Center for Research for Multinational Corporations based in Amsterdam. And let's see if we can see his presentation now. Looks good.
And then I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you to Urgewald and Can Europe to organize this webinar series, and thank you everybody for joining us. And of course, thank you to Pia for kicking off this this interesting debate. I want to begin with a small disclaimer that I am a researcher at SOMO working basically on trade and investment issues, so trade policy and ISDS related issues. So I'm not an expert on energy politics or energy law, nor do I intend to have a discussion on the merits or the effectiveness of the Dutch coal phase-out law. But what I want to do is just to share with you a brief overview of the policy context of the Dutch coal phase-out law, certain specific characteristics of this law. Then we move on to the reaction of Uniper and its claim for compensation. Then I'll just briefly give some comments on the Uniper's claims. From a legal and from an economic perspective, and then to close off, just to highlight the potential impact of these Energy Charter Treaty claims or the threat of such claims. So to start, the coal phase-out law has to be seen and understood from a historical perspective. So climate policy commitments by the Dutch government can be traced back already for decades, but I think it's important to look at the 2013 Energy Agreement for Sustainable Growth, which was an agreement between the Dutch government, energy companies, and dozens of other organizations, really laying or agreeing, among other things, to close 5 of the older coal plants in the Netherlands and to introduce requirements to the newer coal plants, so requirements to introduce techniques known as carbon capture and storage. And really the origins of the current coal phase-out law can be traced back to a parliamentary resolution which was taken or adopted by the Parliament right before the Paris Agreement in 2015, which already called for a coal phase out, or really called on the Dutch government to elaborate a plan to phase out coal. In 2015, we also had the famous Urgenda case. So the Dutch courts actually ruled that CO2 emissions should be reduced with 25% by 2020. This court ruling was upheld by the Dutch Supreme Court in last December. And that means that the government is now bound by this court ruling. In 2017, the coalition agreement of the current government, for the first time, really explicitly mentioned some climate targets, including the 49% CO2 reduction by 2030 and a CO2 reduction of 95% by 2050. And it introduced the plan to close the 5 remaining coal plants in the Netherlands by the year 2030. And despite all these targets and climate ambitions, the Netherlands is still not on the right track to meet those targets. So in 2018, CO2 reduction was only 15%, and it was estimated that in this year, in 2020, CO2 reduction would only be 23%, which means that under the current circumstances, the Dutch government is not able to comply with the Urgenda ruling. And in 2030, it is expected to have a CO2 reduction of 35%. Now, it's obvious to look at the 5 remaining coal plants in this respect, because coal is the least climate-friendly source of electricity. It emits twice as much CO2 as compared to electricity production with natural gas. Just to give you an idea, the Dutch coal plants emitted 20 megaton in 2018, which constitutes around 30% of total CO2 emissions in the Netherlands. So in that respect, a law banning the use of coal for electricity production would be a quite strong tool to further reduce CO2 in the Netherlands. In 2018, the Dutch government prepared this law to prohibit the use of coal for electricity production by 2030. The law says basically that, well, it touches upon the 5 remaining coal plants in the Netherlands. So first, the Hemweg coal plant in Amsterdam had to close immediately, which is owned by Vattenfall. RWE's Amerscentrale will fully shift to biomass by 2025. So then we have 3 remaining coal-fired power plants in the Netherlands, which are quite new actually. That's Uniper's Centrale Maasvlakte in Rotterdam, or the MPP3. RWE's Eemshavencentrale in the north of the Netherlands, and the Riverstone power plant also in the harbor of Rotterdam. Now, the law does not provide for a monetary compensation to the owners of the power plants, but it allows the owners of the plants to shift to alternative forms of energy production, such as biomass or hydrogen power or any other form of fuel. Now, there is a specific article, Article 4 of the law, which allows for compensation in case of individual and disproportional damage. And this applies in this case to Vattenfall, because the Vattenfall power plant had to close before the 1st of January 2020. And Vattenfall reached a deal with the government of getting a compensation of a little over 50 million euros. Now, the law itself was not very controversial in the Dutch parliament. It was adopted with a vast majority. The lower house adopted the law in the summer of 2019, and then the Senate adopted the law in December. And the law obviously took effect on the 1st of January 2020. Now, Uniper has been quite critical of this law, and it has been quite vocal in the Dutch media, because it owns a very new and quite modern coal-fired power plant in Rotterdam. This MPP3 plant was commissioned already back in 2007 and opened in April 2016, ironically one day before the Dutch government signed the Paris Agreement in New York. Uniper made a total investment of 1.7 billion euros, and it has quite a high efficiency rate of 46%. So actually, it is quite a modern and efficient coal-fired power plant. In a nutshell, Uniper basically claims that the coal phase-out lacks a proper balance or a fair balance between the interests of the owners of the coal-fired power plants and the broader interests pursued by the Dutch government in the sense of achieving the climate objectives, climate targets. And basically, it has a number of arguments used in the debate so far. And the first one is that the law itself violates the expectations generated by the Dutch government for a stable investment climate. So specifically, Uniper mentions that back in the day, so around 2003, 2006, the Dutch government proactively encouraged energy companies such as Uniper or E.ON, the previous owner, to construct power plants in the Netherlands. And this was part of a broader desire among within the Dutch government to diversify the energy supply and to move away from the over dependency in the Netherlands on natural gas. And there were also some signals from the Dutch industry regarding high energy prices and the increased competition from neighboring countries such as Germany and France, where energy rates were lower in that time. Uniper also claims that the ban on coal for electricity production in 2030 was unforeseeable, which is quite remarkable given the whole political and societal debate about climate change. Uniper claims that it could only have foreseen this law as early as 2015, when the Dutch parliament adopted this resolution. Uniper also claims that conversion to alternative fuels is not economically viable in 2030. So it contracted a consultancy firm who did a study which concluded that it is very costly for Uniper and the other coal companies to move away from coal and shift to alternative fuels. So according to Uniper, this law constitutes a de facto expropriation. And for that, the Dutch government is required to provide a financial compensation. And Uniper says that by 2030, it will have written off more or less half of its initial investments, so something around 850 million. But the CEO of Uniper Benelux also referred to a number of around 1 billion euro in damages that should be compensated by the Dutch government. In September last year, the CEO of Uniper Benelux admitted in an interview in a Dutch newspaper that Uniper is considering filing a claim under the Energy Charter Treaty. So what we can expect from this claim is that given the reasoning and the arguments of Uniper that we discussed just now, it will probably invoke the rights, like the substantive provisions in the Energy Charter Treaty which relate to a fair and equitable treatment. And there is a specific concept in this standard which relates to the legitimate expectations that companies have for a stable investment climate. Probably it will also invoke the Article 13 on expropriation, whereby governments are required to provide a prompt, adequate, and effective compensation in case of expropriation. And I also want to take note of the fact that also RWE is considering taking legal action. So far, RWE has not referred yet publicly to the Energy Charter Treaty, so there are different options for RWE. But it refers already to expected damages of around 2 billion euros. So in potential, the Netherlands can face around 3 billion euros in claims for compensation under the Energy Charter Treaty. And it is, as Pia also already very well explained, is that the Energy Charter Treaty is a very broad legal regime. So there are far-reaching investor rights enshrined in the Energy Charter Treaty, and because of the very fragmented nature of the ISDS system, it is very uncertain what we can expect of such a claim. Now, the Dutch government is actually quite convinced that an ECT claim is going to be unmeritorious. And I would also like to refer to a legal opinion done by the environmental lawyers of Client Earth. The first thing is that Pia also briefly mentioned is that intra-EU arbitration under the Energy Charter Treaty is quite controversial and may even be illegal under EU law. The Dutch government also explains or thinks that the law does not constitute an expropriation in itself, because it does not order the owners of the coal companies to close the power plants, but it is a legitimate exercise of regulatory powers in the public interest. It is unlikely or uncertain that this law constitutes a breach of the fair and equitable treatment standard. Now, there have been indeed general expressions made by the Dutch government to attract or to invite the energy companies, but it is unlikely that they will have a legal effect in the arbitration case. And most importantly, Uniper could have foreseen CO2 reducing measures as early as 2007, and this has been recognized not only by the government but also by the Dutch Council of State, by other Dutch lawyers, as it was already clear in those years that there would be ambitious climate measures taken, and there would be CO2 reducing measures in the future. But at the same time, I mean, we don't know. It's uncertain what the outcome will be and how such arguments would hold in arbitration, precisely because this legal regime is very much tilted towards the interests of foreign investors. So the investor rights that are in the Energy Charter Treaty are all about, they're one-sided investor rights. There are no obligations for investors. There is very little room for broader public interest, especially in comparison to national laws or even EU law. And also, when we look at certain decisions or awards by arbitral tribunals, we see that there is very highly ambiguous interpretation of these substantive standards of the Energy Charter Treaty. So, for example, in a couple of cases, the arbitrators held on to a very expansive interpretation of what constitutes as a legitimate expectation. So by quoting this from the TechMat case, so host states must provide treatment that does not affect the basic expectations that were taken into account by the foreign investor to make the investment. So that's a very broad interpretation. But other tribunals later on have interpreted in a more narrow way. So it's very uncertain what will be the outcome of such a case. A second set of comments that I want to make is more from an economic perspective, and which relates also to the issue of stranded assets. Actually, we could say that the construction of this coal plant and the opening of the coal plant 2016 was quite a poor investment decision. So there are some indications from research institutes, from NGOs, from other experts working on energy and climate issues, that coal-fired power plants are becoming less profitable over the years. So here I mentioned research from Carbon Tracker, who already calculated that 76% of the European hard coal-fired power plants are loss-making, basically because of higher and increasing carbon prices, low gas prices, but most importantly, increased competition from wind and solar energy. And this will only become more, this competition will increase over the years. There is some excellent research done by Dutch investigative journalists who actually found out that the decision to make this investment was based on very wrong assumptions and poor estimates about the energy market. So, for example, the owners of the three newest coal plants, they expected electricity prices to continue increase, which obviously did not happen after they opened their power plants. So actually the prices dropped. And secondly, they expected benefits from the free allocation of CO2 emissions allowances under the ETS, which in the end also did not happen. So they had to pay a lot more for their CO2 emissions than they expected. So actually there are some indications, and I want to refer to excellent research done by AIFA, who calculated that the current book value of this coal plant alone is only a mere 580 million euro in March 2019. So that stands in stark contrast to the 1.7 billion, the 1 billion euros claimed by Uniper. And another strong indication is that ENGIE sold 4 of its coal-fired power plants to Riverstone in 2019 for a amount of around 200 or 250 million euro. That's for 4 coal-fired power plants. So it's quite clear that these coal plants are not very profitable at the moment, and the owners may never fully recover their investments. So in fact, you could say that this coal phase-out law has been a blessing in disguise for Uniper, because it now allows Uniper to sue the Dutch government and to get some of its money back that it would otherwise have lost. Now, what are the potential impacts of these ECT claims? First of all, we don't have any indication that there is a formal notice of intent sent by Uniper to the Dutch government. The Energy Charter Treaty requires the disputing parties to first try to reach a settlement during a period of 3 months, and if the parties cannot reach such a settlement, then Uniper is allowed to bring a claim under the Energy Charter Treaty, which is under the ICSID rules, which is part of the World Bank, or either under UNCITRAL or the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce rules. Now, why is this important to mention? Usually, when there are claims filed under ICSID rules, there is much more transparency in the sense that the claims are registered on the website of the World Bank, and you can, there's more opportunity for stakeholders to follow the case. Whereas under UNCITRAL or the SEC rules, there's much more secrecy involved. Now, obviously, the most important impact will be on Dutch taxpayers, because they, in the end, if Uniper wins the claim, they will be forced to compensate losses that resulted from poor investment decisions. And this is quite a sensitive issue in the Dutch context, because some of you may know the Dutch government is also planning to cut down gas extraction, many people who live in the area where gas is being extracted suffer from damages to their houses, and they still have to wait for compensation from the government or from the companies that caused those damages. Whereas those companies now are receiving millions and millions from the Dutch government just because the Dutch government has decided to cut down gas extraction. So this is quite a sensitive issue, which also there is also a lot of political debate about it. And secondly, I want to mention here is that it also may contribute to the further delegitimizing of climate policy measures. It will make climate policy measures more expensive. And if more taxpayers' money is spent on these claims and these awards, that may create some controversy and may decrease political support for such important measures. Now, and also to bridge a little bit to what Sebastian is going to present later on, there may be some reputational risks involved here, especially in light of the acquisition of Uniper by Finnish state-owned company Fortum. This will create a new dynamic, because Finland and the Netherlands are both members of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is an alliance where its members are committed to a coal phase-out. And in fact, Finland itself already adopted a similar law to phase out coal also by 2030. So it would create a strange situation in which the Finnish government, in the end, would be responsible, or at least involved in a claim against the Netherlands for doing similar policy measures. And I want to close this presentation by mentioning the biggest impact from this ISDS threat, which is that it creates a potential for a chilling effect. And I want to show you these maps. There are many more countries in Europe and also worldwide who are considering a similar coal phase-out law. So they will increasingly look at what's happening in the Netherlands and what's happening with this lawsuit. And they may think again when discussing these coal phase-out laws in their own countries. And as you can see in the second map, there are still a lot of coal-fired power plants to be closed, and this will obviously have an impact when Uniper continues its case against the Netherlands. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I hand it over back to Sebastian.
Thank you, Bart. Yeah. Don't worry, there is no big third presentation ahead. I will just make a brief introduction why we have called this like the topic of Fortum and Uniper. So we'll just show a few slides. Hope you can see it now. Because the name was mentioned quite a few times. So I'll finish in just a few minutes. Because when we talk about Uniper and about the power plant in the Netherlands, then of course we have to say it was planned by a different company called E.ON back in the 0 years. And E.ON then decided in 2016, because obviously coal was not a good business for them anymore, to split off their fossil assets plus the water plants, etc., but mainly the fossil assets, and created a new company with the name Uniper, which stands for Unique Performance. Now you can judge if you agree if this name is really useful at this point. E.ON at that time kept 46%, almost 47% of the shares. And in 2018, it decided to finally sell the shares. It was always clear that they wanted to get rid of these shares. But in January 18, the decision was taken, okay, we'll sell it to the Finnish utility company Fortum, which bought these shares and even increased their ownership to 49.99% by the end of 2018. Right now, maybe you have followed the news in the last couple of months after 1 year of back and forth between Fortum and Uniper. Fortum has decided to take this step and to try to get more shares of Uniper. They have reached an agreement with two big investors, with Knight Vinke and Elliott, so that by the end of the first quarter 2020, if everything goes well, Fortum should own 70.5 to 73% of the shares of Uniper. The US and the Russian authorities still have to agree to this deal. They have already said that they might, but they haven't signed the necessary papers yet. But if we ask the question, who's really in the driving seat, the history is not over if we just have a look at E.ON, Uniper, and Fortum. Right now, the situation is such that Fortum is the biggest shareholder of Uniper, will be the majority shareholder soon, but Fortum itself is owned 50.76% by the Finnish government. So it's a state-owned company, you can say. So the question is, who is in the driving seat? And whatever we do, whatever kind of questions we ask around this claim threat in the Netherlands or around the cases that we will present in the upcoming weeks, in our opinion, it's always important to always ask these questions also to the Finnish government, because as Bart Jaap has already stated, Finland has already a coal phase-out law. They have agreed on a coal phase-out in 2029. And it would be an absurd situation if a Finnish state-owned company, which is the majority shareholder of the German utility Uniper, would in the end file a claim against the Netherlands for doing exactly the same. Here you can see, I will quickly go through this, but this is the state's portfolio as you can find it on the Prime Minister's or on the Finnish government website, where Fortum is listed as a strategic interest investment. So if there's a strategic interest, I guess it's also their obligation to demand from their company to do what is in line with their own governmental policy. There is an ownership policy and steering committee. There is a minister assigned in the current government, which is right now Titi Tuppurainen. So whenever you have a very detailed question about this, just send her immediately or directly an email and launch this question immediately. She's from the Social Democratic Party, but there are other people that you could contact. This is just, I will just rush through the current Finnish government. It's the new Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, which some of you might have heard. I guess the Finnish people here on this call could tell a lot more, so I really don't want to pretend that I'm an expert on Finnish interior policy. But of course, she's also the head of the Social Democratic Party. Katri Kulmuni, the Minister of Finance, is part of the government as the head of the Centre Party. Anna-Maja Henriksson is the head of the Swedish People's Party as Minister of Justice. And there are two more to mention, which is Maria Ohisalo, who's the Minister of Interior and the leader of the Green Party, and Li Andersson from the Left Alliance. She's the head of the Left Alliance. It's a five-party coalition, and this coalition has agreed on bringing climate change or the fight against climate change very high up on the agenda. So we should remind them every day that this also should be the case then for the state-owned companies and also for the shares that these state-owned companies own. I want to finish just with some sentences from Sanna Marin from her government program that she presented on December 16th, 2019, when she said, "Climate change is the greatest challenge of our future. We must do more to fight against it and faster. This concerns Finland, Europe, and the whole world. It is about the future of our children. This fact has been duly recognized in the government program. We are committed to a carbon neutral Finland by 2035. Our aim is highly ambitious, but it is also indispensable, both for us and first and foremost for the future generations. And I really hope that these wise words will also lead to very concrete action, because this is what we demand from her and from her government." Thank you for the moment. So let's leave some time for questions.
Shall I go? I spotted two on the ECT. Maybe there are more that I didn't see. Yeah.
Sounds good.
So there's one by Ricardo, which came quite early. How do we know if a company is suing?